Twyford, the Principal Commissioner from the Queensland Family and Child Commission. Good morning and thank you for being here. We invite you to make an opening statement and we just asked if you could say your name and title for the benefit of Hansard. And I forgot, is Hansard ready?
Absolutely, thank you, Chair. My name is Luke Twyford and I'm the CEO and Principal Commissioner of the Queensland Family and Child Commission. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Commissioner Natalie Lewis is not able to be here today and I tender her apologies. However, she joins me in advocating on behalf of young people that I will talk about. Commissioner Lewis and I share a view where every Queensland child is loved, respected and has their rights upheld. After speaking with young Queenslanders, my view is that the proposed changes in this bill are a step towards achieving this vision. I would like to start by acknowledging that I do not have a lived experience of the issues raised by this bill, and I do not profess to be an expert in the medical, legal or social fields that underpin aspects of this conversation. But I am here today with one clear purpose, and that is to amplify the voices of young Queenslanders most affected by this issue. These young people have shared their lived experiences with me and described, sometimes in painful detail, the harm caused as a result of the existing system. The main message I've heard is a simple line that states, "No one knows you better than yourself." It's a clear concept, and the hurt and the trauma that can arise when a government or a society does not accept your identity and forces another upon you is clear. The proposed changes in this bill can be framed as administrative. They primarily relate to how a person is recorded in a database. It is about enabling a person to change their record of sex. For most people, a birth certificate is a simple way to provide identity, and it is presented without concern or second thought. For many young transgender and gender diverse people, however, it is not straightforward and it is not easy. Young Queenslanders have told me that an incorrect sex marker on identifying documentation is a constant reminder of an identity that is not them. It raises fear of prejudice, of violence, of bias, and of having to explain their life situation to strangers. Individuals know themselves better than anyone else, and they deserve to have documentation that accurately reflects who they are. The current system doesn't allow this, and this is causing harm. New surveys have shown that gender diverse young people experience poorer mental health and increased levels of discrimination. Almost 6,000 young people from across Queensland responded to our Growing Up in Queensland 2020 survey, with 2% identifying as gender diverse. This survey revealed some concerning trends. 77% of gender diverse participants indicated they'd been treated unfairly because of their gender. This compares to only 27% of female participants and 10% of male participants, meaning gender diverse people experience discrimination 7 times more than their male counterparts. Only 32% of gender diverse participants felt a sense of belonging to their community. That is half when compared with 50% of female participants and 65% of male participants that felt like they belonged. Similarly, 5,500 young Queenslanders expressed their views in Mission Australia's 2022 youth survey, within which 4.3% identified as gender diverse. I was concerned to see that almost 66% of gender diverse young people were very or extremely concerned about their own mental health at double the rate of their peers. Almost 43% of gender diverse young people were very or extremely concerned about suicide, 4 times the rate of their peers. I spoke to young people specifically and directly this week in relation to what this bill would mean to them. One of them said, and I quote, "It will mean fewer young people committing suicide." It was a confronting statement and a confronting conversation. Young people said this change will deliver significant benefit to the mental well-being of transgender and gender diverse people. They described how some in the community believe that the decision to become transgender is something that happens overnight or suddenly, but instead they spoke to me about long, painful journeys of self-doubt, of fear, and of discrimination. They said it's a mentally challenging journey that takes a long time, sometimes a lot of money, and for them, this legislative change would make a world of difference. They went on to say that transgender people living in Queensland face a constant risk of violence. It's seen as though there's something wrong with them, and they feel it. They said constantly advocating for their own right to exist puts them in a ridiculous amount of stress. They said that changes in this bill would represent a community saying, I believe you, and you have the right to decide who you want to be. Young people said making the self-identification process easier shouldn't be seen as a threat to those it doesn't affect. The direct impact is that life would be easier for them, less stressful, less oppressive for transgender and gender diverse people. Having a birth certificate that does not align with a person's gender means young people may be forced to out themselves when performing normal, everyday tasks, applying for jobs, registering for school or university, applying for a passport, or opening a bank account. Young people said in these situations, people in the community feel entitled to an explanation about that young person's history. Interacting with people who don't have an understanding about gender diversity can lead to vulnerability. The personal cost of continually explaining a situation can be a painful, never-ending process of coming out. In closing, the primary purpose of a birth certificate is to provide verification of a person's legal identity. And an administrative change that allows transgender and gender diverse people to accurately state their legal identity will give them control over who they are and will greatly improve their lives and mental well-being. I'd like to finish by acknowledging the young people that had the courage to speak with me about their painful journeys this week, and I encourage the committee to consider this bill through the eyes of those who it most profoundly affects. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Tyford, for your submission. I just wanted to put to you the same proposal or the same situation that I put to other submitters in relation to the argument around historical record. So it's been proposed that other ways Part 5 might be achieved whilst maintaining the integrity of historical records is to insert a different section in the birth certificate to allow for identification of sex or different identification of sex, or for there to be a whole separate birth certificate that allows the transgender person to be able to use that certificate. And I just want your views on that, specifically in the context of young people and specifically in the context of whether or not that will achieve or how that might impact young people.
I think historical records, where they are, who has access to them, would be the defining feature in whether the young people I spoke to might support that as an option. Ultimately, what I heard was that young people were looking for an ability to be treated the same, not to have separate documentation or different documentation, but for the documentation that we all have for them to indicate who they are and who they feel that they are. So a historical record that was not publicly available, was not used by other people, might go some way to addressing the fear and the discrimination that I've just outlined, that it is the public document and the presentation of documentation that causes anxiety and pain.
Thank you.
John?
Can you come back to me later, please?
Sandy?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Tyford. Just previously, and we've brought this up before, that some of the difficulties that submitters are presenting is regarding that sex and gender are two very different things. One is anatomical and the other is what you relate to. Can you please, from the Commission's point of view, how you see either the differences or why there isn't a difference?
That is a very good question, and I think quite a complicated answer would be necessary, and it might be well and beyond my expertise. And what I've tried to outline in my presentation is the experience of young people who, if I frame it within the context of your question, are born asex and identify as a gender and have quite a profound understanding of the differences between those things. Ultimately, what we hope for in the Queensland Family and Child Commission is that all young people, all children, all families are treated with love, respect, and have their dignity upheld. So wherever we're discussing differences, I think there's opportunity for fear and discrimination to creep in. And ultimately, I think there's a distinction, and it comes out in many of the submissions and the people that have presented today, trying to link someone's birth sex with someone's presence in the room, and trailing through the thought processes of those submissions as to how we give precedence or predominance to treating someone before us. Do we place greater priority on the sex that was applied to them at their birth, to their gender that we interpret from what we see, or to their gender that they have chosen for themselves and proclaim to be? And I think at its essence, there's a complicated navigation required for policymakers and government in this situation around how we navigate each of the priority needs of different parts of our society, be it a births, deaths and marriages register, be it young people who are anxious and self-harming because of their treatment. And so I think this is a very important discussion, and I believe that's probably the best answer I can give in terms of my own interpretation of how to balance someone's sex at birth and how someone chooses to identify in terms of their gender.
Thank you.
Jonty?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. Some of the arguments that are being put forward in the submissions is that the advancement of a trans person's rights might actually take away from the rights of other cohorts. Based on your conversations with young people who are cis, male or female, who don't identify as trans, how important to them is it that their peers are able to have their gender identity recognised?
Critically important and life-affirming in the sense of living in a community and a society where you feel like you don't belong, where you are questioned and have doubts thrown around who you are, what you are, and prejudicial words used about you. I think that's a devastating way for young Queenslanders to grow up in Queensland. And I do think, and I've touched on it just briefly in my submission, that there is a link between fear and risk in some of the current debate. It is okay to be afraid of things we don't understand, but we need to logically work through what that fear is and where it's coming from, and be very cognizant that the size of fear doesn't relate to the size of risk. I did put in my submission that there is no evidence that transgender, or indeed any gender, is more dangerous to children than any other gender. And I think that's an important point to make in that discussion overall, that there is a difference between levels of fear and levels of risk.
Thank you. Laura or John?
Mr. Twyford, thanks for coming in. I think you mentioned one of the submissions that said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that people shouldn't be afraid of something that doesn't impact them. Mm-hmm. It was in your opening statement. Is it your submission to the committee today that changes in this bill won't have any impact on members of society other than those people who go through the process to change their birth certificate?
I think I touched on that in 2 points in my opening statement. I'll have to check how I read it out, but one was a direct quote of a young person who was talking about this bill predominantly impacts their lives, and other people who are not going through the process of changing their sex marker are only indirectly impacted by that change. So I do stand by that distinction the young person is making, that unless you are applying to change your sex marker, that part of this bill has limited and probably indirect impact on the rest of society. That's not to belittle or not acknowledge all the submissions that have been made by people with very strong views and, in many cases, legitimate views from their own perspectives around the impact of this bill. But when I balance the stories of young people self-harming and attempting suicide because of the failure of documentation to reflect and represent who they are, with other impacts that change in a sex marker would have, I do think there's a direct and an indirect distinction. And in closing, I did reference that I encouraged the committee to see this bill and to enter this debate through the eyes of those who it most profoundly affects. And in my eyes, that is the young people who have made representations to me around the impact the positive impact this bill would have on them.
Okay, so just going back to my question, it's not your submission that there'll be no impact on others, but that it'll be an indirect or limited. Indirect or limited?
Indirect or limited.
Right. Thank you.
John T?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mr. Twyford, some submitters have raised the concern that the bill could create kind of this slippery slope towards young people rushing into gender reassignment surgery. I was interested in your views and comments on that view.
Yeah, I did ask a young person about that point, and under the current system that there's a requirement to undergo that surgery before having your identifier made. And in their eyes, and I think I agree with the logic, that might be encouraging people to surgical procedures for the very reason of changing their identity, having their identity record changed. So I think that argument can work both ways, both for the system currently in place and for the system post the bill. And what we need to do and consider is what are the processes and protections that are in place around a young person making that decision. And the bill does outline steps around responsible adults making statements in a court process that might apply. So I think the concern can be addressed by the procedures and the protections that are in place in the bill.
Jason, do you have a question? Take it by the silence, no. John T?
Just to come back to that, are you aware, you may not be in other jurisdictions where this type of legislation has moved ahead, whether there's been any kind of upticks in gender reassignment surgery or upticks in regret of young people around changing birth certificates?
No, I'm not aware.
Thank you.
Laura or John? Sandy?
No questions. Thank you, Chair.
Jason, are you there? Okay. Jonty, you got a question?
No, I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Looks like you let off a little bit earlier, Luke. Thank you for your attendance today. Thank you for your written submission.
Thank you.
And hope